Good morning, good morning. You waking alive? Yes. My name is Joel, if we haven't met before, and just before we go on, we're going to jump right in today. If you haven't got one of these, now is your time. Slip right into the lobby and grab one of these, okay? No shame. No one's going to stare at you. No one's going to throw anything at you. Grab one of these. Gospel of Matthew, copy. Grab one for your spouse if you're a good husband or a good bride. Go ahead and do it. No shame, no shame, no shame. Grab one of these, and we're going to dive in today. Excited to jump into a collection of messages, as you saw in that video, through the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is the first. Don't worry, y'all. You can watch this preamble later. Matthew is the first of four Gospels. The first of what we have is the Gospels, and the Gospels are really this. They're a portrait of the life and ministry of Jesus. Okay, they're four books about the same person, so there's not like different Jesus in each Gospel. It's four portraits of the same person, almost like if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John almost put their own like Netflix series out. I heard there's some kind of series like that. I don't even know the name of it, like the Choosing or something. I don't know, but if they told an account, a biographical account, they were actually there. They walked with Jesus and got Starbucks with Jesus and laughed with Jesus and cried with Jesus. And they wrote these biographical accounts to pass on to future generations of, hey, we had this amazing opportunity to walk hand in hand with the Jesus, with the Son of Man, the Son of God, fully human and fully man. It's all converging in one person, and we got to spend a handful of years. And so they wrote these accounts, and now we have them, which is just a crazy thing. If you think about 2,000 years of history, that we have them now, and we can encounter the living, active, breathing, moving Jesus in and through the Scriptures. I'm just really grateful that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John chose to put pen to paper and gave us some accounts of the life of Jesus. I hope you are too. So Matthew's the first one of the Gospels. Matthew's also the first book of the New Testament. So really, Matthew's a connector from the Old Testament story to the New Testament story, and it bridges this new era really in the history of Israel, the history of God's people throughout all generations. And so we said, hey, what would it look like for 7-8 weeks? We're still ironing all that out, but a handful of weeks, handful of months through the summer to travel through the Gospel of Matthew, to really hang out there and see like what might Jesus do in and through us, through reading about, through hearing, through discerning what he's already done. And so I hope that you'll be engaged however that looks. I talked to someone yesterday from Journey. They're like, yeah, we're gone 8 weeks straight in the summer, which I want to take a nap just thinking about that. That sounds awful. But for some people, that's their dream, right? Like get out of Dodge, whatever. But I hope you engage, whether it's through YouTube or through a podcast. And one of the ways we want to stay engaged together and travel through Matthew together is this reading plan. So if you pick one of these up in the lobby, one of these scripture journals, you'll have one of these tucked inside it. It's from today. So if you're a daily person, get your reading in this afternoon, okay? It's 5 readings a week for the next two or so months. So from July 9 to September 9, 5 readings a week, and you will cover the book of Matthew and then some, okay? So you get some prophets in there, some New Testament epistles, and I believe as we do that together, as we engage these Sunday mornings together, and most of all, as we hear from the Holy Spirit, that God wants to do powerful things in and through us, okay? So summer may be a time to chill out work-wise, to engage in a different family rhythm, but we're just going to go for it, okay? We're not chilling out here. We're going through Matthew, all right? If you're ready, say, I'm ready. I'm ready. Okay, let's turn to the first verse, first chapter of Matthew chapter 1, and we're going to read something that you probably skip over in your devotions, okay? So unless you're a really detail-oriented person, like got to read every single word, you probably skip over this. It's what's called a genealogy, okay? So we'll talk more about that. Let's read this, Matthew 1, verse 1. I'll read it aloud, and you could read along with me. It says this, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The book or the record or the writing of the genealogy. Genealogy has the same root word as genome or gene or Genesis. It's the beginnings of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Let's stop right there. Mentions 2 names very much out of order. If you know your Old Testament history, you know why is David before Abraham? Like Matthew's already messing this thing up, okay? The son of David. The son of David was a prophecy from Jesus, about Jesus, from the prophets in the Old Testament. And it was prophesied that the Messiah, like the chosen one, the anointed one to lead Israel, to lead God's people, to establish his kingdom throughout all ages, was going to come from the line of David. The second name is the son of Abraham. Now, Abraham really was like the father, you may have heard of like the father of faith, or Abraham's in this chapter of Hebrews that's called the Hall of Faith. Like Abraham is really the genesis of the people of Israel. God called Abraham like this voice in the sky that Abraham had never heard. And somehow he knows it's Yahweh, it's the true God. It's not an idol, it's not a false God, it's not a pagan God. It is Yahweh, the God of all gods. And he says, come with me. I'm going to send you into a new place. I'm going to bless all generations through you. So right off the bat, what Matthew is doing, he said, hey, this is the chosen one. This is the leader. This is the Messiah. And this is the book, or this is the genesis of where he's coming from. Now, you see all these names, and I won't read all these names. You don't want to try to pronounce them, and I don't want to try to pronounce them. Okay, I just read them in my heart. Okay? But you'll see some of those names. Some of them might ring a bell for you. Some of them might, oh, I know that story. I know Jonah. I know Jacob. I know Judah. I know some of those names throughout the Old Testament. Some of them you probably won't recognize. Some of them are not really significant that we would think of, significant people in the story. But there's 46 names. If you picture it like this, if you've been to maybe an end-of-the-year concert or performance for a student, and you know when like the whole cast comes out, right? And it's like, okay, now the bunnies are coming out, and the bunnies come out and they bow, and then like the fairies are coming out and they come out and they bow. And then at the end, the main character or the main characters comes out. And everyone cheers and usually like a standing ovation and that kind of thing. This is a little bit of what Matthew's trying to do. He's letting us know this list of names, 46 names. It's if you were to go on like Ancestry.com and you search Jesus, like this is maybe a version of what would come up. And more than just the specific names, I just want to draw attention to a few. But Matthew, in his genealogy, really does a bad job. He really does a bad job. First of all, he said David before he said Abraham. Okay, that was like the first strike. The second strike, you'll notice maybe some of these names are female names. And that was a big no-no. That was a big no-no in genealogies. It is a paternal thing. It is from the patriarch, and you trace it down through males. Another strike against Matthew is he includes Gentiles, for who God's people would say, no, they're the outside. They're outside of God's covenant promise. So all these things, and it makes us ask, why did he write in the way he did? Why did he include this list of names? Names like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah, Zerah. And the thing about it is, and Matthew has some of the best names. He really does. Abraham, Solomon, David. You have these warriors, these kings, these leaders. He's got some of the best. But Matthew also has some of the worst of the worst. He's got some names that were straight up failures. You think about Jacob, who had all these sons, and then his own sons, his oldest sons, lie to him, try to kill his youngest son, their brother, who God clearly spoke to. You have Tamar, who sold herself as a prostitute to her father-in-law. You have Amon, who was a king for just about 2 years, and then he forsakes God and has this tragic downfall. You have Rahab, who was a Gentile prostitute. You have Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, mistress of David, who David slept with, had this son Solomon ordered her husband to be killed in the line of battle. It's kind of a best of a best list, but it's also a little bit the worst of the worst. One commentator said this about the genealogy, this list of names Matthew provides for us. He says, as Matthew shows us the royalty of kingship gained, the tragedy of freedom lost, and the glory of liberty restored. And in that is the story of mankind and of each individual. See, Matthew is not just trying to give us a massive list of names. He's not just only trying prove that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's Israel's chosen one. Matthew's trying to help us understand a really simple but foundational thing, that God is writing a story. God is writing a story. These names don't just represent figures. They don't just represent a family line. They don't just trace ancestry. He's trying to help us understand that God is writing a story, that he's been working, that he's been moving, that he's been speaking. And one of the things I hope that you encounter as we go into the Gospel of Matthew is that God is writing a story. And here's the powerful thing, that God has not written a story, not God will write a story. God is writing a story. It started in Genesis. It comes to us today, and it will continue beyond our lifetime. And he's saying that these names are figures, they're characters in God's story. And one of the things, I just want to talk about a few things about the story God is writing. As we look towards the next several months, as we look towards the story of the Scriptures, as we look towards what Jesus is up to in our lives. We even sang about the story, right? King of Kings. In the darkness we were waiting, without hope, without light. Till from heaven Jesus came running. There's mercy. Now, we're a part of a story. And I want to share a few things about his story. The first is, his story is not a horror story. His story is not a mystery sci-fi story. His story is a redemption story. His story is a redemption story. His story in the world, in the story of the Scriptures, his story in your life and in my life, it's a story of redemption. It's a story. I didn't know this, but two of the songs we sang today had that word in it, redeem. What does it mean? What does redemption mean? What does redeem? It's reclaiming and restoring something that was lost. When you think about the redemption, God's reclaiming and his restoring of all creation. His story is a redemption story. And there's a lot of stories being written today. There's a lot of stories being told today. We try to tell our own story. We try to attach ourselves to stories, to narratives. The news is telling a story. Culture is telling a story, multiple stories. But God's writing a story, and his story is a redemption story of all creation. If you think about through Abraham, that God calls this people out of being nothing. He assembles this people to himself. He says, I'm going to bless all people through you. Think about the life of David, who had all these ups and downs, but ends his life with this redemption story. Think about your life. What things in your life have been reclaimed and redeemed and restored? Miranda led us in that moment earlier. What part of your story is a redemption story and continues to be? It's a redemption story. The second is this: his story includes everyone. His story includes, one of the things that this genealogy that often we'd read over, that we'd skip, we'd not even try to go there. This list of names remind us that God includes everyone, that his story includes everyone. The person that you like, the person that you don't like, the person that you would choose in the Scriptures, the person you wouldn't choose, the person you have a rift with right now. His story includes everyone. It's for women and men, in and out, Gentile, Jew, Americans, Kenyans, all around the world. His story includes everyone. And the striking thing about that was that Matthew was written to the Jews. The Jews. And like I said earlier, the Jews were like the in crowd of the Scriptures, of the story of God unto this point. And you ever been a part of like an in crowd, or you like knew of an in crowd? I knew of one. I went to Caledonia High School as a freshman, and the in-crowd for Caledonia freshmen was the freshman football team, okay? The freshman football team. And there was an in-crowd. I happened to play freshman football, but I was not in the in-crowd, okay? Like, there was people that they had played since they could walk kind of thing, and I was way over my head with this freshman football thing. But there was the in-crowd. Maybe you've been a part of an in-crowd, or maybe you always feel like you're outside of the in-crowd. Matthew was written to the in-crowd, and part of what he wants to know is that God includes everyone. His story includes everyone. Actually, Peter, one of the first disciples of Jesus, has this revelation. He has this encounter with God, and God speaks to him in a dream. And he speaks to Peter, who was a Jew, and to Cornelius, who was a Gentile. And they both have the same vision. This is in Acts chapter 10. Fast forwarding a little bit through the New Testament, it says this: Then Peter began to speak. He said this after this vision: I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. How many are grateful for that? How many are grateful for that? That God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. His story includes everyone, which means this. When you think about the story God's writing in the world, throughout history, in the scriptures, in your life, in my life, in our church, in our communities, that we can be encouraged is this: that your goodness doesn't qualify you, and your badness doesn't disqualify you. Your goodness or your credentials or your righteousness would be a scriptural term for that. It doesn't qualify you when you think about Jesus and his grace, and your badness doesn't disqualify you, which is really good news, because Paul, an apostle of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, later on would say this: that all have fallen short, that all have not been good enough, but that his story, his redemption, includes everyone. And no one is qualified on their own merit, and no one is disqualified. His story includes everyone. Another thing about the story of God that he's writing, that he will write, that he has been writing, is that his story, for one reason or another, I don't know, his story often starts small. God's redemption often starts small. Think about your life. Maybe you're here today and you're a follower of Jesus, and God's done amazing things in your life. Maybe sometimes it almost feels detached from the reality you're living in because it's so different. But God has redeemed, he's restored, he's done powerful things in your life. Think about how some of those things started. It was a conversation. Or how many stories I hear where, like, well, they just happened to invite me to this event or this small group. Or they just happened to invite me to a Billy Graham crusade. Or they just happened to share this song on Facebook. And God starts small, and there's something that he loves to do with small things. Jesus had a thing for small things. Jesus loved talking about like seeds and coins and pearls, like things that you could lose very easily. I don't know why. Like, talk about the big thing. Like, it's hard to miss. But Jesus loved talking about small things. I wonder if in part is because Jesus' story started small. See, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was just a few miles away from the Herodium. The Herodium was one of the palaces, one of the structures that Herod the Great erected during his time. And Herod the Great was a fascinating person. Some people think in his context, he was the wealthiest, most dominant person in his context throughout history. And Herod the Great had a paranoia problem. You read the later verses in chapter 1 and 2, and you see that Herod the Great was really threatened by a newborn baby. It was just as funny. If you ever held a newborn baby, like there's just this lump of like limbs and skin. It's like Herod literally was threatened and paranoid by the birth of Jesus. And Bethlehem was just a couple of miles away. I'll show you a few pictures of the Herodium. These amazing structures on this hill, and it really just overshadowed anything around it. Like, it just kind of overpowered. Like, you could see it from miles and miles and miles. And Jesus was literally born in like the shadow of the Herodium. He's literally born in Bethlehem in a little cave off in the middle of nowhere. And he's born in contrast to the Herodium. And when Jesus is born, Herod goes into freak out mode. He's like, this is not okay. I'm threatened by the king of the Jews. Go to the next picture here. You see some of the intricacy of the detail of what was built, looking over the landscape. And a few miles away, in a teenage girl, Jesus comes to us. And he I don't know how much Jesus weighed, 7, 8 pounds. This is the Son of God, the Son of Man, God in flesh, the Messiah, the chosen one. He comes to us, and his story starts really small. And sometimes that's how it starts in our life. Sometimes that's how it starts in our own story. His story starts small. Talking about the birth of Jesus, one of my favorite songwriters writes this. His name is John Mark McMillan. He wrote this song a few years ago around Christmas time. It's called Baby Son. Let me just read these lyrics for us. He says, "We thought you'd come with a crown of gold, a string of pearls, and in a cashmere robe." Doesn't that sound nice for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? Like, that's a good outfit. "We thought you'd clench an iron fist and rain like fire on the politics. But without a sword, no armored guard, but common born in mother's arms, the government now rests upon the shoulders of this baby son." His story starts small. What's the small beginning of God's redemption in your life right now? What thing is off kilter? What things needs redeeming and reclaiming that God is starting really small, but surely is bringing his story, his redemption, his grace, his mercy, his transformation, his story in the scriptures, his story like we'll read about in the Gospel of Matthew, his story in your life, it often starts small. Starts small. The last is this, is his story is unfinished. His story is unfinished. Jesus left the earth, he left his life and his ministry with like an ellipsis, not an exclamation point or a period. He left it unfinished. His story, his redemption story, is still being written. His story is still being written. His story is being written every time someone takes ground for his kingdom. His story is being written every time you and I are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. His story is being written every time you choose to forgive, every time you help someone who's marginalized, every time you live as though he is Lord and you are not. His story is being written. His story is unfinished. I want to take you to the last book of the New Testament, Revelation. A lot of people say, when's Jesus coming back? Like, has Revelation started to happen? Are we in the last days? Are we in the last chapter of the story? Well, Jesus seemed to think we should live as though that's true, though no one really knows, right? He said, I don't even know, like the Father only knows. I don't know that stuff. I'm just doing the will of my Father the best I know how with this unfinished story. Revelation 21. The Apostle John has this vision. He says this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with men.'" This is what he's all about. "He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. Hear the redemption, hear the restoring. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Some of us today, this is the biggest takeaway all day, holding on to this hope of no crying, no pain, no tears, no mourning, no brokenness. And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Write these down, for they're trustworthy and true. His story is unfinished. His story is unfinished. God's writing a story. And we'll see it over the next couple of months, all these little stories within the grand story. But we have a tendency, we have as a human beings, we love story. And you know anyone in your life who has just a knack for storytelling? I'm always trying to learn what makes those people great. When they start telling a story, the whole room just zooms in on them. And we're just people, something about stories, something about people's stories, something about movies, something about books draws us in. Lisa Cron, who's an author and wrote a book called Wired for Story, said this. She says, "Story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to." She does all this research, all this study into cultures and societies and what are common things among human beings all across the earth. And this theme of story she just could not get away from. I love that line. Story told us what to hang on to. I wonder for some of us today, if it would be a chance to be rekindled, to be reminded that God's writing a really good story in us and around us, and he will complete it. It includes everyone. You have to have eyes to see, because sometimes it starts really small. And like John reminds us in Revelation, there will be a day that God establishes his story with a period. It is done. It is finished. Everything is new. So I want to give us a couple things today. The first is, would you engage the story? Would you engage the story? Would you engage the story that God is writing? Would you engage maybe this summer, maybe the next few weeks? Maybe you'd commit to just a week, maybe commit to a month, to engage the story of God a little bit differently. I don't know what that means for you. Maybe that's more consistently. Maybe that's in a different way. You would just be reminded and rekindled for some of the things, how God has worked, how he has moved into this point, and how he's continued to. Maybe you'd engage with this reading plan. You'd engage the story of God, and you'd read some prophecies, and you'd read some New Testament epistles, and you'd read some of the Gospels, and engage the story of Jesus. Maybe you'd engage your story in a new way, your story of redemption. Maybe you would take the step to be baptized next week. Maybe you'd take the step and say, I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to engage with God's redemption publicly. I'm going to be baptized, respond to Jesus, and celebrate with those who are also following him. You'd engage the story. You'd be thankful again for his grace. You'd be thankful again for his mercy. You'd be thankful again for his inclusion, his adoption, his choosing of you. You'd engage the story. The second, would you extend the story? To extend the story. Would you be part this week, the days to come, of God's reclaiming and restoring of all creation to himself? One of the things Jesus said is that I give you the keys of the kingdom. God's given us a chance to write in his story. God's given us a creative license to extend his story, to live it out, to build the kingdom, to spread the story. Would you engage the story? Would you extend the story?